Hello, everyone, and welcome to Redesign Your Life Today. This podcast is about transformation. It's about making aware of, that in life everything is possible, transformation is possible, and it's why I like to really welcome guests on this podcast who had really interesting and insightful stories. Could be about different kind of subjects, and so I'm Daniel Kobryner, mental fitness coach, and today it's a pleasure to receive a very special guest. It's Todd Medema. And Todd is the author of How to Surf a Hurricane, which is a heist thriller showing that stories about climate change and adaptation can be fun and hopeful. He wrote it because he believes the future doesn't have to be a dystopia, and he got tired of only reading stories of doom and gloom. Todd studied technology, entrepreneurship, and design at Carnegie Mellon University. He worked on self-driving cars and board games before discovering a passion for clean energy. He spent 4 years working on grid-scale battery storage and now offers product management consulting to clean energy companies. Todd spends his free time playing games, climbing rocks, and gleefully riding his electric bike everywhere. He's currently working on expanding the Hurricane universe. So, Todd, a warm welcome to this program. It's really a pleasure to have you here. And first question is perhaps introduce you a little further. I just gave but what's your story, Todd, if I may ask?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me, Daniel. I'm glad to be here. I would say my story is really one of constant growth and transformation and learning about new puzzle pieces in the world and fitting them together. You kind of went through my career history of studying computer science and design and then working on self-driving and clean energy. And all of these were these inflection points where I had a collection of skills and interests, and I learned about something new and figured out how to bring it into the fold of my life. At one point I had been doing product management at a self-driving car company, and then I was getting more and more involved in climate and clean energy. I was volunteering on the side. I was lobbying senators for Citizens Climate Lobby. And then I was like, why not do this for my full-time job? And so then I explored transitioning from being a product manager in self-driving to a product manager in clean energy.
Okay, right. And okay, it's two different areas, self-driving cars and clean energy. And what brought you to this particular area, clean energy?
Yeah, so I'd been volunteering in the general climate space for a while, talking with politicians, running the local green club, trying to organize, meatless Mondays and EV showcases and things like that. But the thing that brought me to clean energy specifically was asking this question: how can we help combat climate change without putting a huge burden on the individual and making it feel like, it's all their fault and their responsibility, rather than being like, oh, you have to stop using straws or something. It's like, how can we fundamentally, as a society, restructure our systems to just have less impact for the same amount of life and vibrancy? And I did a lot of research, and clean energy came out as the clear winner of, if we can, make our electricity grid cleaner, then literally everything we do as a society automatically becomes cleaner.
Okay, wow. This is very powerful. And so you said you did a lot of research, yeah? So can you just, take us through what are the various kinds of clean energies today?
Yeah, there's a lot of different sources of clean energy. Probably the most famous is solar. It's remarkable because the sun shines everywhere, and it's so unbelievably cheap now. It's actually, I believe, the cheapest form of energy, even without subsidies, and very easy to install. So there's solar. There's also wind, which is nice as a complement to solar because the wind tends to blow at night and more during the winter, whereas solar is more during the summer when it's sunny. So they kind of balance each other well. There's hydroelectricity, which is amazing, and the countries that have a lot of rain and mountains can really generate a lot of power this way. There's also nuclear. Different people in the environmental movement have differing opinions on how clean nuclear is due to the nuclear waste challenge, but there are actually new generations of nuclear reactors that have been designed but not built yet that have, for the most part, solved or at least massively reduced the waste problem. There's also a lot of fun new ones that are coming out, like tidal generators that generate power from the back and forth flow of tides. And so I'm constantly watching for these new developments as well.
Oh wow, this is fascinating. I've seen it. Isn't it in Japan that they are doing trials like that with the tide energy
Yeah.
in Japan? Yeah, and I think, tell me if right or not, but in places like Iceland, where they've got a lot of how do you say, um,
Or
hot
geothermal.
springs. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
They're using it as well, aren't they? Just to
Yeah, geothermal is another absolutely amazing source of clean energy. In fact, I would consider it one of the best ones because it's completely consistent. Just the biggest problem is there's not too many spots on Earth where it works well. Iceland has a ton of geothermal resources, and so energy there is actually incredibly cheap and very consistent. But obviously, if you don't live like over a hot spring, there's only so much you can do.
Exactly, because I suppose it's difficult to store and perhaps to transport this energy. I mean, you can keep it to the territory, but it would be difficult to bring it to other places, I guess.
Yeah, and there's actually some really cool developments happening in terms of energy transmission.
Okay.
So, uh, you know, transmitting energy long distances is actually a valuable part of making the grid cleaner. Because if you imagine, one of the big problems with solar panels is if it's cloudy in your town, then like you lose most of your solar production. But if you have a really big grid, if you have, electricity connected from Spain all the way to like Germany or from California to New York, in that large of a territory, there's going to be lots of sun somewhere. And so the larger the grid, the more you can balance out kind of some of the variability of renewable energy.
Okay. No, this is so interesting. And just a question, I mean, out of curiosity, I think in the solar panels, have there been a lot of like technology developments?
Yeah, there's actually been an amazing amount of improvements to solar panels. Obviously we talk about the cost and how we
Mhm.
can manufacture them for less than ever. I think the cost has fallen by like 90% in the past decade or
Wow.
two. It's
Yeah.
wild. But the other thing is efficiency improvements. So if you had solar panels installed in your house in, the year 2000, you could re-solar panel your house and probably produce about twice as much energy for the same surface area.
Okay. No, thank you, sir. And this is really fascinating. And another question, if I may, it's about hydrogen. Because people
Mm,
say now it's like technically the cost could be, I mean, could use hydrogen. So what's the latest on that?
yeah. So hydrogen is interesting because it's something that you can produce with just electricity. You have water, you run hydrolysis, and then you end up with hydrogen and oxygen. And so it's a very clean product compared to something like oil, where,
Mhm.
when you burn it's very bad for the environment. The challenge with hydrogen is that it takes a lot of energy to produce. I
Ah,
I want to say somewhere around 60 or 70% of the energy produced in hydrogen is just lost. So it's
okay.
about a third as efficient as just using the electricity itself. And so, there's a lot of use cases where that doesn't really make sense. Like with cars, that's one of the reasons we're seeing electric vehicles dominate over hydrogen cars is the electric vehicles are just 3 times more energy efficient. Um, that being said, there are some really interesting use cases, especially when you consider that we're entering an era of abundance with renewable energy, where as we have more solar panels and wind, that means that when the sun is really shining everywhere, we're going to have actually too much electricity. Like we need something more to do with that electricity that can be kind of conditional on, it's okay if we turn it off when it's cloudy. And so hydrogen is a very promising thing in that regard because it's a pretty simple process. You're just turning water into hydrogen. And so to use this glove of solar power when we have it to produce hydrogen, then it can kind of serve as energy storage. We can then use that hydrogen for other use cases, when it is cloudy.
Wow. So it's quite promising. I mean, normally it should listen to this, it should kind of drive the costs down, shouldn't it? Of,
Yeah.
I mean, well, yeah, of electricity, generally speaking, yeah. So, and
Yeah, and it's very cool to watch all of these different solutions continue to advance. When I was volunteering for Citizens Climate Lobby, one of their mottos was the solution to climate change is not a silver bullet, it's silver buckshot. So we need all of these technologies.
okay, and no, thank you. And so, what's your take? Because obviously, it's a big topic. I'm in the UK here. I'm French, and we speak a lot about this. There was this COP 21 in Paris a few years back. It was like, okay, eventually countries are going to take decisions on the world level, and how do we stand now with this? And what are for you the biggest threats, but perhaps as well the biggest opportunities? And I know it's a big question, Todd.
That
The
is that
climate
is a
change.
big question. Yeah. I think one of the challenges that's pretty unique to climate change is how it is a global problem and a global solution.
Mhm.
And so that makes kind of geopolitics a threat to it all. Like when you have a country like the United States, unfortunately elect a leader who's um, not prioritizing the climate, shall we say, um, it it kind of drags the whole world back in terms of implementing and agreeing upon solutions. Um, that being said, I think there are also absolutely incredible opportunities here. We've talked about with clean energy how the cost of solar has decreased by like 90%. Um, the solar electricity industry is growing unbelievably fast, like over 50% per year. It's honestly probably one of the fastest growing industries on Earth. And so when an industry is growing, there's tons of money to be made. And it's one of these beautiful moments where, the capitalist free markets and what's good for the planet are in total alignment. Like, let's install solar panels to reduce our emissions and make a ton of money doing it. And I think, solar panels are the obvious examples, but there's really a lot of other industries and places to look where we can try to find those alignments where what's right for the planet ends up also being the most long-term, financially viable thing.
Mhm. Yeah. And in this regards, how is AI contributing to improving, this sector?
Yeah, I have mixed feelings on AI. On one hand, you've probably read the headlines of how much electricity AI uses,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it
Mhm.
it does use a lot. Um, at the same time, the company I work for, Next Tracker, they are in the solar industry, and we're using AI and machine learning to design even more optimal solar panel power plants. So we do these massive grid scale power plants, megawatts and gigawatts of solar panels, and by using AI, we can design it more optimally to perform better and to reduce costs. And that's kind of a win. Using AI to make the grid cleaner is a pretty cool feedback loop.
Yeah. So this could be definitely on the positive side. I mean, in terms of, at least optimizing the use of the resources and 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 in you wrote a book, Todd. Yes, I mean, and
I did.
I'd like you to. I'm changing a little bit the topic, but I'd just like you to take through your book. What was the inspiration, and what's the story beyond the book?
Yeah. So I wrote a book, How to Surf a Hurricane,
Yes, yes, okay.
and I call it a hopeful climate heist. It's like Ocean's 11 meets The Martian in a world adapting to climate change. And the inspiration for this really came from something that someone had shared with me a few years ago. This idea that climate has a storytelling problem. We we tend to overly focus on numbers, gigatons of CO2, percents this, degrees that, rather than stories. But we as humans are inherently story-oriented creatures.
Hmm.
And so when you look at stories about climate, there's three broad archetypes. There's the billionaire tech genius will save us, our kids will save us,
Hmm.
or the future is going to be this dystopian hellscape that like we brought on ourselves.
Okay.
And by limiting ourselves to these three types of stories, we really limit the audience that we can bring in to the environmental movement.
Hmm.
And by broadening ourselves to other archetypal stories, we can get more people excited about the climate. And so, I thought to myself, I've never read a climate heist. I love heists. I know a lot of people who love heists. What if we could get people who love heists excited about the environment?
Wow. Okay, this is a very interesting. And how would you define heist?
Ooh, this is a
Because you see, I'm French, and you see, I'm not so familiar with this word. So,
well, you know what happened with the Louvre the other day with the ladder truck and heist
sorry, with the
with the Louvre, the art museum where some people stole some of the art
oh, in the
using a ladder
Louvre. Oh,
truck.
yes, of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, to me, a heist is usually like someone starts with an idea of like I want to take a thing, and then they recruit a cast, a crew, usually with different skill sets. Maybe someone drives the ladder truck, someone else is an acrobat, uh, and then they go through this criminal activity to take that object, overcoming hurdles along the way. Um, then usually they succeed, but there's lots of complications.
Right. And you know what? You see, of course, now I get it because, and of course, it rings a bell. There's this movie called, or this series called Money Heist. And Money Heist, it
Mm,
was in Spanish, La Casa de Papel. So, it's, if you've seen this movie about people robbing I think this was like the kind of a bank in Spain where they produce the money. So,
hmm exactly.
so now I get it. And when you look at what's going on the planet, for instance, you talk about hurricane, right? I mean,
hmm
so my understanding is that hurricanes, or they call it different names, but it's the same thing, I think, in different parts of the world, if I'm correct. But
Cyclones and
yeah,
yeah.
cyclones, yeah, exactly, depending on which area of the planet it's located. What I heard is that there are not more of them than there used to be, but what changed is really the strength of them. Is it correct?
Um, they're definitely increasing in strength. Uh, I believe they're also increasing in frequency.
Okay.
The because the underlying mechanism, if you think about it, is that a hurricane is basically a way for Earth to release and redistribute thermal energy. Too much heat energy builds up in the tropics, and then the hurricane is just like, "Brah, I'm gonna like throw the heat energy northward or southward if you're a cyclone." And so with climate change, we're building up more and more heat in the tropics. And so it has to release the energy through either more intense storms or more frequent storms.
Yes, no, exactly. Because again, I think in the Gulf of Mexico, the temperature of the water has risen a lot. I think it's like 2 degrees. I mean, I'm talking Celsius. I don't know in which. Where are you
Oh yeah,
located,
I'm
Todd?
fluent in Celsius.
You located in which country are you located, if I may ask?
I spend time in France and in the US.
Okay, yeah, because I think in the US it's more like Fahrenheit and
Yeah. Easy trick is just, when someone quotes a Celsius degree change, just multiplied by two. So 2 Celsius is 4 Fahrenheit.
okay. And see, people say that one of the biggest, I mean, challenges today is like the melting of a big part of the Arctic Ocean. I mean, all the glaciers and the icebergs and which are melting and basically, and if I understand correctly, this phenomenon had been increasing over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years a lot, at the bigger scales than ever before. And with the incidence that it can higher the level of the sea, and then some islands might become inhabitable. Is it something which you encounter in your studies and in your
Yeah.
research?
Yeah, and there's a lot of different effects of climate change, increasing storm intensity and frequency, rising sea levels, uh, drought, and change, basically lots of changes to and the environmental patterns that we know today. And that's something that I wanted to address in the book uh, through a perspective of realism and hopefulness.
Hmm.
I think climate scientists are looking at the world today and they're saying we kind of missed the window to completely prevent this. We're already kind of hitting that 1.5 C. We're not at net zero yet, so it's going to keep climbing. I think the most recent estimates are that we're looking at more of like a 3 degrees Celsius, 6 degree Fahrenheit increase in global average temperature before we kind of cap it off and hit net zero. And so it would be kind of inauthentic to write a book about climate where it's like, yes, we solved it, there's no impacts. And so to me now, any part of the story is not just how are we going to lower our emissions, but also how are we going to adapt and survive to the changes that are pretty much guaranteed to happen now. Um, because it's very easy to look at the news today and feel a degree of hopelessness. Like, oh, we missed 1.5 C. It's, back to the story archetypes, the future is going to be this dystopian hellscape, and like there's nothing we can do about it. And that's not true. Um, every little bit of emissions we reduce still has a positive impact. It's not just 1.5 C or bust. 1.6 is still better than 1.7, and so on. And also, these impacts like rising sea level, they're going to happen. And we can choose how we adapt to it. We can kind of stick our head in the sand and be like, oh, it's not going to happen. And then the next, in a couple of years, our house is underwater. Or we can be smart. We can acknowledge that it's happening and think about how we want to adapt as a society. One of the characters in the book actually lives in France. They farm the salt marshes in Gironde, and they have to confront this issue. And so they, work with their cooperative to work with the city to plan on building a dam that will help protect the marshes from rising sea levels and storm surges. And so there are hopeful models for how we can work together as communities and prepare for this.
Yes, absolutely. So, and I suppose one of the first examples was what people did in the Netherlands, where a third of, if I'm correct, a third of the country should be now underwater, but they build this huge dam. I mean, but they're still, now they have to go on because it's going further. So it needs a lot of work and efforts to build these protections.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting I'm half Dutch, so I love everything that
Okay.
the Dutch are doing. But there's also this interesting discussion as a society about managed retreat, which is this idea of sometimes maybe instead of building giant dams to defend everything, we should decide to let an area return to nature. And, I think of Florida as an interesting example of this because I think the Netherlands kind of lends itself well to this idea of like let's build a dam and protect the whole country because there's not a ton of coastline. There's a couple small openings that are relatively easy defensible to protect the whole country. But Florida is the opposite. It's a peninsula, which means it has a tremendous amount of coastline to protect a very small amount of land. And so that's one of those situations where we as a society might look at it and say, we can't build a dam all the way around Florida. So, what next? How do we help that land transition back into a natural state? How do we help the people who are living there relocate to somewhere that's kind of less expensive to us as a society?
Absolutely. So we need to look at another way of doing things. I mean, for instance, as well, if you think in Africa, there are a lot of people who are, again, climate refugees because there's so much heat, particularly in the center of Africa. You cannot live there. I mean, I'm not talking about the wars, which of course make the situation worse, but some areas don't see any water there.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's happening with climate change is the weather patterns are changing.
Hmm.
So some areas are getting just less and less water, where, maybe before people could survive by farming, but now there's just not enough water. And so they're going to have to relocate. Other people, they're going to get too much water. Their rains are going to increase in intensity. The sea levels are going to rise. And so, any attempt to live there or farm there is just going to be like flooded away. And so that's, one of the things that we're going to have to contend with as a society is, mass immigration, mass relocation. Um, I heard a number that it could be up to 1 billion people will need to relocate this century. And that to me stops becoming a question of like immigration, like let's have like a border where we kind of let people through one at a time. 1 billion people is simply too many people to like kind of let through the ticket gate one person at a time. It's the sort of thing that we have to really structurally think about as a species, how we want to accommodate our brothers and sisters in this relocation.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I think obviously in the last editions of the COP, they talk a lot about this. I think they try to find agreements between countries because things are inevitable. I mean, this that some areas won't be livable. And see, you mentioned about floods, for instance, and obviously what we've seen in Europe over the last few years is the much more floods and and it brings to an area I think you touched on now is that a, a big part of, I mean, at least some of these floods are due to the fact that areas which before were left on their own for like flood zones have been built concrete, so there's no way, no how do you say, no way for the water to go.
Yeah, and um, that's a thing that has changed as well, is humans have developed a lot more land. And so, it used to be hundreds or thousands of years ago that we would leave these floodplains for farming. And the
Mm.
floods are actually a very beneficial thing in terms of natural cycles because the floods deposit nutrients. And so, like the Egyptians, they would actually use floods very intentionally. Like, let's flood our farmland so that for years and years after that flood, the crops are much more productive. And so that's, I think something that modern thinking has maybe drifted away from a little bit. Like we've switched to this idea of like, let's build a dam, let's control the river, no more floods. Now we can build towns and cities and skyscrapers in these flood zones. And, we're starting to see the consequences of that decision where now the floods are too strong for us to control. And back to that idea of relocation, maybe ultimately we need to decide that some of these areas we shouldn't be living in and building structures in, but we can still participate in that natural cycle. We can still have it flood, use those nutrients to grow crops. And it's just a matter of listening to nature and finding ways to work with it rather than against it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talk about floods. We can talk as well about forests and fires, actually. This has been a big issue over the last few years. I mean, all over. I mean, in America, Los Angeles, in big parts of Europe. So how do we
Yeah,
deal with that? How can we?
yeah, fires are a big one, and I think especially scary. There's something so primal about fire that feels even more kind of overwhelming. Um, and from what I've read about fires, one part is certainly caused by climate change, specifically because it's drying things out, and so the natural cycles are changing, where the trees um, are just like more prone to fires. There's another aspect of forestry management where Native Americans understood this for thousands of years, that a little bit of fire regularly helps prevent a lot of fire
Yes.
rarely. And so there was actually, at least in the US, I'm not as familiar with other countries' practices, but for a while the US took this perspective of like all fire bad. And so if the tiniest spark
Mhm.
happened in a forest, we'd go and put it out. But from what I've heard, we're now starting to understand that if we return to kind of how nature used to work before, which is there'd be fires fairly frequently, but they would be smaller fires, and they would kind of burn off this layer of um, the loosest, most combustible things. That prevents these kind of catastrophic, large-scale fires. And yeah, to me, it feels like another one of those moments where if we go back to listening to nature and the cycles rather than trying to control it and make everything perfect all the time, it'll actually end up being cheaper for us and safer and just kind of better for both the humans and for the natural cycles.
Yeah. So there's a lot of a lot to think of today, and obviously, I guess another very important topic is the availability of water, of drinking water, and this. So how are we going to solve that? Because some places don't see any rain anymore. Do you believe that, for instance, the process of, how do you call, desalinization of water is going to 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 increase? So how will we supply people with water all over the planet?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question because water is so fundamental to life that it's really one of the main reasons that people will have to move due to climate is changing access to their water supply. And it's not just, droughts, it's also that too much rain and flooding can actually contaminate water supplies. So it's kind of this weird, like if you have too much water or too little water, it becomes undrinkable. Um, the research I've read on desalination is pretty promising. The technology has reduced in cost a lot, especially thanks to how much cheaper solar power has become, because it is a pretty energy intensive process. But you can imagine that the hottest days are also the sunniest days and the days that you need the most water. So there's a nice little feedback loop of being able to use solar energy when you have it to desalinate water so that you can have water all the time. Um, so I think desalination is going to be one of the many buckshot solutions to helping people access clean water.
Okay, no, this is great. And I read as well that, for instance, now with the use of drones and AI, you can you can kind of scan the earth. I mean, imagine you have a field to see which part needs water and how much. So I think this could be quite beneficial if it's extended, couldn't it?
Yeah, no, the technology used in agriculture is leading to a lot of promising results. It's called precision agriculture, and it's this idea that we can be a lot more efficient, not just with water, but with pesticides and herbicides. Rather than just blanketing a whole field in chemicals, you can be like, this plant, this plant, this plant, this plant, um, which again, saves you money as a farmer. It also helps protect the environment because most of that overspray is just going to get like swept into the water supply, which is bad for humans and life in general. And so that that's one improving approach to agriculture is this kind of technology precision, use less. And we're also learning more about agriculture that works in harmony with other systems. So permaculture is growing in popularity, where
Mhm.
instead of having monoculture fields, you grow many different plants and animals all on the same farm, and they provide mutual benefits to each other. So trees might shade and cool down the crops growing next to them, so they actually survive droughts better. And you might have livestock or chicken that graze on pastures, and then when they poop and their hooves dig it into the soil, they're actually fertilizing your land for free. So we're starting to rediscover uh, these ways of working that are maybe like, I don't know, a bit more like intellectually complicated than just like, plant a million acres of soybeans and just like cover it in chemicals, but ultimately are are not just cheaper, but they're actually regenerating the local ecosystem.
Yeah, so the good news is that actually we're kind of coming back to what nature used to be, and to realize that, as you said, there's this need to combine all the resources, could be the animals, could be the plants, could be the choice, to because we've got to really take care of Mother Nature.
Yeah. I'm reading an amazing book right now called Cradle to Cradle that goes into details on these. And one of the ideas that's really stuck with me is this idea of most of the things that we do right now as humans are cradle to grave. We produce it, then we throw it away. But if we could switch our mentality to cradle, which is you produce something, you consume it, and then it like you reuse it or you reproduce it, and you have these infinite cycles in a circular economy, uh, it can be better for everyone in the long term. It just requires us to rethink, you know, how we do agriculture, how we do packaging and product design. But ultimately, we move from this model of extraction and throwing away to a model more like nature, where a tree grows, sheds its leaves and its seeds, which fertilize the next generation of trees, and you just have this like infinite loop of trees that also supplement the birds and the bees. And um, I think there's just such a tremendous hopeful opportunity for us as humans to embrace more of that natural infinite cycle thinking in our lives.
Well, Todd, thank you so much for sharing all these beautiful insights. For our listeners, I think there's so much to got. If you had like, say, two or three tips you would like to, a pieces of advice you would like our listeners to stay with, what would it be?
Yeah. So I think first is to take care of yourself, because
Mhm.
this is a marathon and there's a lot of forces who make money from the way that the system is today who are trying to make us feel depressed and hopeless.
Mhm.
And the best way to fight that is to bring ourselves joy and energy and positivity. And so whether that's going for a walk in nature or meditating or just, I don't know, getting drinks with a friend, doing things that help recharge and replenish us is so critical to the lifelong uh, ongoing battle that this is. And then the second thing that I would suggest is finding a community. It's one thing to kind of sit at home and scroll on your phone and feel overwhelmed by it and wonder like what little action can I take as a person. I'm not going to recommend any individual actions. I'm going to recommend that you find other people who also care about these things, and then together inspiring each other and working on solutions that are larger than any one person, because that's ultimately what we need. We need to work together to build these solutions.
Wow, this is so inspiring, Todd. And if any of our listeners wants to be in touch with you, again, can you show us your book? Obviously, the title will be in the, but it's yeah, how to
Yeah, so
yeah.
the book is How to Surf a Hurricane, and you can learn more and contact me at howtosurfahurricane.com.
Okay, well, Todd, thank you very much for your time and for really bringing all this knowledge and this wisdom. And this was absolutely beautiful. And thank you for everyone who listened to this interview. And you see that there's a lot of hope there. I guess each of us needs to contribute at our level to make this planet a better place because it's for us, it's for our children and the next generation. So let's make sure we treat it the best possible way.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you, and see you everyone at the next episode. Thank you for watching.